It is the first installment of our team deep dives, and we're starting with the champions, two-time Walter Cup champions, the Minnesota Frost.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On NHL channel, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Erica L Ayala here alongside Rachel Donner, and we are going to walk you through the PWHL. But specifically, if you listen to our last episode, you still can go check it out. It's on the NHL channel. If you listen to our last episode, you know we're starting to do the deep dives, and we're starting with the reigning champions, two-time Walter Cup champions, the Minnesota Frost. And at the end of the show, we are also going to give you the updated free agency signings. So if you're not necessarily a Frost fan, hang tight. We've got some updates around the PWHL. But what we're going to do is talk about how the Frost were able to get their most recent championship. Who did they add to the team, whether through free agency, of course, the draft, but of course, also, Rachel, we have to talk about the players that left and then answer some difficult questions, including, can they three-peat? Can you even imagine? They're in a position to be the only team to ever have won the Walter Cup, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We're going to get into
says every other team's fan base in the league.
Right, exactly. Like, whoa, relax. But I mean, a lot of excitement when you're the two-time champs in a league that's only been around for 2 years. I mean, you know, of course we're going to start there. So how we're going to do this is, again, we're going to talk a little bit about how the Minnesota Frost even got to a position to repeat as champions. Then we'll talk about the roster changes. We'll talk about the draft class. And then again, what are the big questions that we have for this team? Now, Rachel, we've been talking about the Minnesota Frost all of PWHL season number 2, and we weren't always talking about them favorably, let alone as a team that could repeat as champions. What do you think really led to this team being able to find their way not only in the playoffs, but then to repeat as champions?
Yeah, I think it was interesting because you're right. They were very inconsistent over the course of the regular season. And I think that, you know, when we got to crunch time and the last day of the season is determining who makes the playoffs and what the seeding is going to be, I think we just got to a point where in those last few games, Minnesota, just those leaders stepped up and got it done. And when you have veteran players like Kendall Coyne Schofield, Taylor Heise is a phenomenal player. At least Stecklein had an unbelievable second half to her season, right?
Yes.
And so just all the pieces came together, and you also had some other teams that maybe didn't do that. So that's kind of where we got.
We'll get to those teams later,
playoffs,
right?
Right. And the championship. But I would say it was a combination of Minnesota getting it done and other teams maybe not playing complete games.
Yeah, you mentioned Kendall Coyne Schofield, friend of the podcast. We've had her on the show before. Finished 5th overall when it came to points, 24 points, equitably split between goals and assists, 12 in each category. You mentioned Taylor Heise, such a young and up-and-coming star.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm very curious to see how the PWHL helps to anchor what Taylor Heise hopes to do for USA Hockey, which we only have to wait a few months to maybe figure that out. But Taylor Heise in the top 10 when it came to points, 22 points, 8 goals, 14 assists. And I mean, you know, Sophie Jacques, we've talked about before. Yes, absolutely. Lee Stecklein on a tear for a period of time there on the back end of the regular season definitely helped this team out. But it just seemed like whatever the inconsistencies were, the bugaboo, whatever you want to call it, when it came to crunch time and the Minnesota Frost saw that the field was effectively, like you said, wide open till the last day of the regular season, they were really able to hunker down here. And that, I think, gave them the momentum, the confidence that they needed to be able to get through the playoffs.
Yeah, I think so. And that's how we got here with the repeat. And I think we just saw like their second championship rings on their social media the other day, and like they look real nice.
I mean, like championship rings, always nice. I always think it's interesting to see, like, I'm here in Indianapolis, so I've got WNBA on my mind. But like a player like Breanna Stewart, she's got a lot of rings that she's accumulated over time. Like, how do you decide which finger all of your different rings go on? Like after a while, it just gets a little redonkulous.
Yeah, well, they're athletes, so I am sure they're extremely superstitious and have like specific things that they do and a ritual for it, because that's what they do.
Okay, so now you've given me a thought. The next time we have someone on the Minnesota Frost, from the Minnesota Frost, we're going to have to ask about that. Like, how did you decide which finger to get your ring fitted for? Like, or did you? Like, I don't know. Like, what's the vibe? Tell us all the things. All right. So the big question then, right, is can this team three-peat? Can this team three-peat? But we're not going to answer that question right now. We'll get into that as we go on through this episode. Again, this is a deep dive into the Minnesota Frost. Don't worry, if you're not a Minnesota Frost fan, we are going to do this for every single team, including the 2 expansion teams. But now let's talk a little bit about Minnesota and the roster changes. Let's actually first start with what hasn't changed. Who's coming back, Rachel?
Right. So we have those core players that we talked about already. Then Britta Carl-Selene is the 4th protection slot. So she will be back with the Minnesota Frost. And then we have players that were the OG foundational players that are still with the team in Kelly Panic and Grace Zumwinkle. And we have Katie Knoll just re-signed on another 1-year deal. And Klara Himlarova is on a 2-year deal, so she has 1 more year left in that contract. So that's kind of your forwards in there. You have Natalie Buckbinder and May Batherson re-signed, and I think probably most importantly, their goaltending duo is back, and that's huge. Like in all of this expansion craziness, for the Minnesota Frost to keep that goaltending duo of Maddie Rooney and Nicole Hensley, like A+ work there.
100%. And it's something that we talked about in the playoffs, right?
Mm-hmm.
The not quite equitable split, but still divvying up of the net. And that's not something that we really saw, Rachel, from other PWHL teams. But I continue to wonder if making sure, I mean, you have Nicole Hensley. You have Maddie Rooney. If you know anything about USA Hockey, then you know those 2 names, right? So you've got 2 netminders who know what it's like to play in high stakes situations at the international level. So they're bringing that to the PWHL. And I do think that it stands, I'll put it this way. It stands out to me that they are the team that most consistently was able to utilize multiple goaltenders, specifically Rooney and Hensley, comparative to the rest of the field.
I would say so. I would say Montreal did a good job for the most part, but it was definitely like way heavily weighted to Anne-Renee Desbiens, right? Right. But as far as having a true tandem, like this is the gold standard for the league.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not the only thing, I don't think, especially in in the way that series went down with the Ottawa Charge. However, knowing that we got so many overtimes, I think you're hard pressed to say that goaltending didn't play a role and a factor. And don't worry, we're gonna talk about Gwyneth Phillips. Don't worry, we're gonna get into all of that. But I do think that there's something to, even in the NHL. I mean, you and I both cover an NHL team, obviously. And I do think that the conversation, the way the NHL is trending, is to having more of a, maybe more of like a 60-40 split is like the
Or 3 goaltenders, let's
or
say,
three
like
goaltender.
the
What,
team I
right?
cover.
Well, because like the new
So
CBA, right? And there's no more e-bug. Like we've got new ways that you can incorporate. Yeah, I think that that's something that we're seeing. It's a trend that we're seeing in pro hockey. And so is that something that Minnesota is going to continue to deploy? Well, they have both of their goaltenders, to your point.
Yep.
And so we'll see. Again, we'll break down all of the other teams, see what other teams are looking like, and if they try to replicate, right? Because hockey overall, usually it's a little bit of a, a copycat kind of situation.
Most definitely.
Once
Most
you see
definitely.
success, you're like, we want some of that. So I think that might be something that is replicated. But there are probably other things that are going to be a little harder to replicate, even though the Minnesota Frost did get some key players poached, Rachel, because we had not one but two expansion teams. We'll talk about that and more on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
We have all been there. You log on early and you wait in that waiting room for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for the show you were dying to see. For me, that's Lady Gaga. I'm not going. I'm a little mad about it. And live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. And that's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices actually drop the closer it gets to showtime. You can save up to 60% off with their killer last minute deals. And if you're tired of endlessly scrolling, trying to find the best deal, Game Time Zone Deal picks the best seats in the section for you. And if you wonder what your view is going to look like, they've got panoramic views so you can make sure you know what you're getting before you buy. And with Game Time, the price you see is the price you pay. There's no hidden fees. So take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem with the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
And thanks as always for making the Women's Hockey Report your first listen on a Saturday. Rachel Donner, L Ayala, that's me, just in case you weren't clear. We are here to talk the women's hockey. But again, we are going into our series where we are breaking down each PWHL team, doing a deep dive, and we're starting with the two-time champions, the Minnesota Frost. Now, we talked about who is returning to the team, Rachel, but again, every rose has its thorn or something like that. But we know that this was, it's not just the turnover that you see after winning a championship, but it's also the turnover that you see when not one, but two expansion teams enter the league, which is exactly what's happening in this offseason leading up to season 3 in the PWHL. So either way, Rachel, there's no chance that the Minnesota Frost, I don't want to say no chance, a very slim chance that the Minnesota Frost was going to be able to maintain their complete roster, right? Because you've got not one but two expansion teams. I mean, they were inevitably going to pick someone from Minnesota. If I'm picking as an expansion team, it's probably a good place to start with the two-time champions as far as building out your roster. So let's talk first about expansion draft. Who did we see leave the Minnesota Frost? They went unprotected and then taken either by Vancouver or Seattle.
Right. So in that process, I would say the biggest effect on the Minnesota Frost was to the blue line. Now, we had the expansion signings before the draft, and the Frost lost Sophie Jacques and Claire Thompson, which are just like the backbone.
Yeah.
I mean, at least Stecklein aside, those two were then the remaining part of the backbone of
100%.
this Minnesota Frost blue line and were a huge factor in their championship. And I think in some ways the forwards may be a little bit more replaceable, but it is going to be tough going to get a blue line that is as effective as this Minnesota team was, at both ends of the ice. In the draft, they lost Brooke McQuigg and Denisa Krishova. And so, both excellent players and big factors. But I think ultimately, we'll talk about their strategy and in replacing these players. But blue line, like they lost 4 defenders. That's tough.
That's big time. And again, we talked about, of course, what Kendall Coyne Schofield was able to do, what Taylor Heise was able to do. I mentioned Taylor Heise top 10 in scoring and points overall. Sophie Jacques right there at 11. So, I mean, that's out the window. And then if we talk about free agency, also someone in the top 15 when it came to points in the regular season, Michaela Cava.
Yeah, they lost several players in free agency to other teams signing, mostly Vancouver, it seemed like, but
Oh man, yeah, Michaela Cava, someone that I was able to cover in the NWHL, but specifically the PHF years. Melissa Channel Watkins, Liz Sheppers, Maggie Flattery. So, like you mentioned, just a lot of people wanting to tap into what was happening in Minnesota. You also had Brooke Bryant, who was invited to PWHL Seattle camp. And we don't have all of the details, but I would imagine if you're getting a camp invite by another team, or I don't know, maybe I'll ask this, Rachel, in what would be the scenario of someone reaching out to extend a camp invite, to a player that was most recently on another PWHL team?
Well, it's clear that the Frost were not going to give her a contract, and this was a chance for her to maybe make a different roster, and an expansion team is your best shot there. But even so, those teams are going to be tough to make as well.
Yeah, 100%. And we've talked about those rosters a little bit already on prior episodes, but again, we're working through the entire league team by team, starting with the Minnesota Frost today. But yeah, I didn't want to assume, but yes, you would imagine that if a player is invited to a camp, that there was some indication, right, that they were effectively available. and maybe looking for a new destination. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this team rebuilds. But a part of that rebuild, of course, Rachel, is through the entry draft, as we shall call it here. And 6 picks overall for the Minnesota Frost. And you talked about what they lost on the defensive side. 4 defenders overall. Do you think that they got what they needed through the draft?
I mean, I think they got off to a really good start in the draft by selecting Kendall Cooper with their first round pick. I think they had to pick a defender with their first pick. There was just no way around it, considering where they were. They've managed to get her signed already, which is really good. But a real solid defender from Quinnipiac in Kendall Cooper. And I think, she's got to be in their top 4 for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Another player signed already that came through the entry draft, their second round pick, 14th pick overall, Abby Hustler. Like, what a name, right? I mean, come on, for a pro athlete, that's awesome. Comes from St. Lawrence, not a defender, a forward, but again, there was plenty of firepower, kind of that grit and sandpaper that I like to talk about, Rachel, that I think was lost, whether it be through free agency, expansion, with Denisa Krishova, Michaela Cava. So Hustler, I mean, I'm very curious to see, a product from St. Lawrence, what she's able to do stepping in, because again, one of the 2 draft picks that Minnesota has already signed.
Right. And I think it's also interesting that they used their 2nd round pick and their 3rd round pick for forwards from the same university here. And I think that kind of chemistry, bringing them both into the fold, I think it's nothing to sneeze at. I think it's something that could work to their advantage as they're trying to like re-piece together a roster, as all the teams are doing. But for them particularly, I think it was an interesting strategy.
Yeah, for sure. And then rounding out, so to speak, the picks for the Minnesota Frost in the 4th round, 30th pick overall, Ava Rinker, a defender from the University of Connecticut. Round 5, 30th pick overall, Vanessa Upson, a forward from Mercyhurst. And then another defender, Brooke Becker, 46th pick overall out of Providence College. And so, more or less an equitable split here. No goaltenders, but are we surprised, Rachel, given what we talked about in the first segment?
They had that luxury.
Yeah.
They absolutely had that luxury.
100%. So now, let's talk a little bit about how are we seeing maybe some of these pieces fit in. Now, if we look at, and this is something that you added to the notes, Rachel, but if we look at what was, right, the last kind of matchups and pairings that we had, you had Coyne Schofield, Heise Zumwinkle, McQuigg, Panic, Kava, Curl Salemi, Petrie, Krishova, Himlarova, Sheppers, Knoll with Bryant also as the forwards. On the defensive side, you had Thompson with Stecklein, Chanel Watkins with Jakes, Flattery with Butchbinder. And then we talked about goaltending. We know that's staying the same, so we're not even going to move on from there. So where do you think, there's some holes here that you have to fill on the top D line, the entire second pairing? Then you have, Kava missing from that second line, Krishova. Where do you see some of these either draft picks or acquisitions perhaps fitting into the folds, Rachel?
Well, it's really interesting because I think from a strategic standpoint, Minnesota very clearly has decided that they were going to take their existing players and their draft picks, and that's pretty much it. Now, on the blue line side of things, they did sign free agent Sydney Moran, and from the Boston Fleet. And I think that's an excellent pickup, but that's really the only one that they signed off of another team's roster. They really just decided to hunker down from within and build from within to combat this expansion process. And I don't think any other team did it quite like this. And I think it'll be interesting to see the results. But I think, maybe Anna Szigeti will crack the top 6, but, we'll see how it plays out in camp. But I can't see them breaking up that top line there. But, if you have a second line with Kelly Panic and Britta Curl with Szigeti, maybe that's what we're looking at. But there will certainly be other players there to try and crack that top 6. But then maybe Abby Hustler comes in at your 3C and Katie Knoll comes back at your 4C. But beyond that, we're still not sure what's going on with Dominique Petrie. An RFA as of recording still hasn't signed yet, but we'll see what happens with her. But there are other options, but that bottom 6 is kind of wide open, I think.
Yeah. And does that go back to something that we've talked about on previous episodes? Does this kind of bake in some friendly, healthy, necessary competition to kind of see
Absolutely.
what the roles are going to be here. I think that could be really interesting, including with those draft picks, as you mentioned. I just want to circle back to Sydney Morin, because we were talking off line before we started recording, and I forgot that Morin wasn't on Minnesota, because to me, Morin is Minnesota, is
Right.
like a Minnesota is a Minnesota kid. Played professionally, collegiately in Minnesota, right? And so this is a return to home and a return to some familiar players as well. Just given where she's come from, Sydney Morin, from Minnetonka, Minnesota, played at Minnesota Duluth. Also played abroad in the SDHL, but played for the Whitecaps as well in the PHF. So Minnesota, without a doubt, you're always going to see, and I love this for Minnesota, you're always going to see a Minnesota pro women's hockey team build from their own crop, right? And why not? It's the state of hockey. And so, yeah, we see Morin come back.
Yeah, and for her to be the only one, and for it to be somebody returning home, I think it does check out. It absolutely checks out. But I think a huge key piece for this blue line, no question. I think she'll end up on the second pairing, but you never know. Could get some first pairing time.
Yeah, so we'll see how that all shakes out. But coming up next, now we have to answer the tough questions, Rachel. We've gone through the roster, what it looked like, how the team got to the finals once again. Now we have to talk about, is this a team as constructed on paper, at least from what we know, that can compete for another Walter Cup? We'll talk about that, as well as some signings. We're gonna lay off the Minnesota talk just for a little bit towards the end of the show and let you know the most updated recent signings as of this recording. That's coming up on the Women's Hockey Report. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday morning. Erica L. Ayala, that's me, alongside Rachel Donner. Yes, I grew up on Nickelodeon, all of the things. But we've been talking about the Minnesota Frost. Come on, it's all that. Great segment. Anyway, we'll leave that to my geriatric millennials, as I think we're known now. But we've been talking about the Minnesota Frost, how they re-upped, who they lost, what they did in the draft. Now we got to get to some of the questions that I'm guessing Frost fans want to know. And let's just start with the broad question. What are the realistic expectations? Now, we can take this with how they've constructed the roster leading up to season 3, but also I think you kind of have to factor in the fact that, I don't know, no one else has won a championship in the PWHL. So what are the expectations when you are the 2-time defending champions coming into season 3, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think no question that's the goal, is to repeat again. And they've set this standard for themselves. And despite the many changes to the team, the core is still there to a large degree, and they're going to want to run it back, and they're going to do everything they can to get there.
Yeah, 100%. We've talked about Lee Stecklein, friend of the podcast. We've talked about Kendall Coyne Schofield, another friend of the podcast. But Taylor Heise is still there. I mean, we think about what Curl has been able to do, Panic has been able to do for this team. And again, I don't think we can overstate, Rachel, how important it appears to be. Early returns, if you want to say, in just 2 seasons, but having that continuity in net, knowing that you have 2 netminders that have played at like the top of the top elite level, we're talking Olympians here, that they can compete and are sharing the net. I think that just seems to be huge for this Minnesota team. Definitely stands out to me. How long that will last, I guess we'll find out as more young talent continues to enter the league. But yeah, I think that the standard has been set, right? Why wouldn't you want to go for another title? That being said, Rachel, we've already talked about it even on this podcast or this episode, but certainly throughout the podcast, that it hasn't always been smooth sailing in the 2 years that they did win a championship.
Right. I think the one thing that is different this upcoming season, well, there's two things, but everybody's in the same boat in terms of these two very important factors this season. Number one is the upheaval of expansion.
Yeah.
Is that you have expansion teams that are playing together for the first time, and all the existing teams are in some ways playing like expansion teams because there's so much change, right? So I think that levels the playing field a little bit. The other thing that levels the playing field is the Olympic break, and there's going to be focus on the Olympics. There's going to be breaking up teams into their national teams and then coming back together afterwards. We've seen them do it with Worlds, right?
Right.
It's not like these players haven't done that before. However, you're putting both of these together in the same season. And I think, I really think that kind of creates a clean slate in a lot of ways for all the teams. And I think that makes Minnesota's desire to three-peat, in some ways it makes it easier because everybody's in the same boat, but some ways it makes it harder because everybody's in the same boat, right? And any team could pop. You just never know.
You never know. And again, this is a team that's had to, in the oh so eloquent words of John Quill Jones of the New York Liberty, has had to thug out some wins, right, to even get back to a final. So I think that's so interesting that you talk about the expansion draft and the two teams coming in expansion being the great equalizer. I think that's really fascinating. And on paper, I think, as we will talk about for the next several episodes as we go team by team here, Rachel, on the Women's Hockey Report, I think that holds water. All right. You got that one, Rachel.
I know.
Pause attraction. It holds water. But
the defense is wrong.
No, the defense is wrong. Marissa Tomei,
I sat next to her once at a play. It was glorious. Anyway.
I mean, we're going to need that full story on another episode of the Women's Hockey Report because, I love Marissa Tomei, truly. But that's not what this episode is about, we promise. So it was just a little, we give a little entertainment with our hockey talk. But our hockey talk. But if you look at how this Minnesota team, though, is built with the leadership, that to me stands out. And it's not to say that a Hillary Knight, right, who is now with PWHL Seattle, are you going to sit here and tell me that Hillary Knight is not a leader? No. Erica is not going to do that. And what I will say, again, because I'm in Indianapolis and very heavy WNBA on my mind, I got to speak to Nneka Ogwumike. She is 14, somewhere around there, year veteran.
Right.
And she's the president of the Players Association. And she, for the first time last season, Rachel, played on a new team, as in not the team that drafted her in the Los Angeles Sparks. And she told me this hilarious story almost a year ago, because we were at All-Star last year, to where I was asking her, what's the transition? You've only played for one organization. What's the transition like? And she told me this story. She's like, Erica, I'm so embarrassed. But she went into the huddle, said whatever she needed to say, impassioned, leadership just oozing right out of her body, just like radiating this aura of leadership. And she's like, on three, go Sparks. And everyone was like, this is the Seattle Storm. That story, I tell because no matter how long you've been in the game, when you join a new team, there are some things that you have to then get acclimated to. And I'm curious to see the field because we don't have that problem necessarily with the Minnesota Frost. But I'm wondering if that will be if the Neka Ogumake, situation will be something that I don't know. Does Hillary Knight have a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to adjusting to a new team, or some of the other players that we've seen move on? Whereas the Minnesota Frost, as we've talked about, they're key players, but truly, I think the heartbeat, their leadership is still intact, Rachel.
I think so. I think that's going to be huge for them. And it could end up, especially down the stretch, being that
Mm.
factor that gets them back there in the end. But, I do think, of all the teams, they had the most daunting task ahead of them in this
Yeah.
expansion and off-season process. And, you know, task number one, rebuild their blue line. I think they got a really good start in their draft and free agency for that. Fill in with draft picks as necessary, and then bring back the goalie tandem that works. And we'll see if it pays off for them.
Yeah, if it ain't broke, right? We also do know that they've invited some players to camp. And this is always an opportunity to maybe again build in and bake in that competition while also giving like a genuine look to players who maybe did not go through the draft, or were not necessarily targets in kind of the pomp and circumstance, if you will, of a professional league. And we've seen, I mean, I don't watch much football, but I heard there's this guy Tom Brady who's kind of awesome, and he was kind of picked really late in the draft, if I recall correctly. So you never know. Like, the draft is not the end all be all. And so, there are a couple of players that Minnesota has invited to camp.
Right. So we know about Cameron Sikic, who's a defender, and Alyssa Machado, who's a forward, that they've invited so far. There's probably other names that have been invited between recording and when you're hearing this, but we're slowly getting those names over the course of the off season, and we'll see what that full list looks like as camp approaches.
I mean, overall, Rachel, just given our conversation, I think that Minnesota has a good a chance as any team, right, to be competitive. And I think there are definitely some things that stand out to me. The goaltending tandem for sure stands out to me. And there's a reason, Rachel, why in pro leagues veterans are considered a very valuable commodity. Players that have, if we're just keeping it to hockey and the MNHL, right? Players who have won a Stanley Cup or been a part of a Stanley Cup team, they tend to be players that you want to target in free agency. And that's for a reason, because you know what it takes. You know what it takes to win. And I still think there's a decent amount of that, players that have that right in their bones, in their muscle memory. And I don't think you can overlook that. But we will see how the rest of the field, Rachel, is preparing to combat exactly that, their leadership and their goalie tandem, because in the coming weeks on the Women's Hockey Report, we will be going team by team and doing a deep dive and analysis just like we did on today's episode. Next up, of course, will be the Ottawa Charge. They were the other team in the 2025 PWHL final. But before we close out today's episode, we want to get to some of those other teams that we will be talking about in the weeks to come, Rachel, because it's still free agency and we do indeed have some signings to talk about.
We do. And I think that, some of this is free agency, some of this is draft picks that are getting signed for sure. And, you got to start with PWHL Seattle, who signed Hannah Murphy, speaking of goaltending, to a 2-year deal. And this is a huge part of their goaltending strategy, right? And so Hannah is absolutely going to battle for, she may end up being a backup in her first season, but still, like, it's going to be an interesting look in Seattle in terms of what they do. And then they signed Jenna Buglioni to a 2-year deal as well. So they're just like getting through their draft picks there. And Ottawa is doing the same. They re-signed Stephanie Markowski on the blue line, but they managed to sign 4 of their draft picks this week since our last episode there. And I think the most interesting signing they made of those is Sani Ahola, the goaltender, to a 1-year deal. She has won a bronze medal at Worlds for Finland multiple times, but also played at St. Cloud State, which is, nothing to sneeze at either. And so now with Phillips and Ahola, they have their tandem.
Yeah. I mean, goaltending, I do think is going to be, in some ways the great equalizer, right? And in some ways it's going to be the separation, right? And we've already seen that in the PWHL. So yeah, I think Gwyneth Phillips, what a fantastic story. I mean, we talked about that before, and now she has an opportunity, presumably, right, to be the number 1 with Emirates Mashmeyer moving on to Vancouver. So very curious to see how things play out. Boston re-signed forward Shea Maloney to a 2-year deal. We talked about Brooke McQuigg, and has officially signed with Vancouver after she was acquired through the expansion draft from the Minnesota Frost, who we've been talking about on today's episode. And we also mentioned Abby Hustler. So that kind of wraps up and rounds out at least what we know as of the time of this recording. And we say that every week because inevitably, as soon as we stop recording, something else pops up. So we just want to put that caveat out.
That Friday news dump always gets us.
Always gets us. That's what happens when you're a Saturday morning show. So that's our show for today. This was a deep dive into the Minnesota Frost. We will take on the Ottawa Charge next week. But for Rachel Donner, who is also your co-host of the Locked On Flyers podcast, my name is Erica L. Ayala. I am your host of the Locked On Kraken podcast. And this, of course, has been the Women's Hockey Report, presented to you by the Locked On NHL channel, part of the larger Locked On Podcast Network. We will catch you next week, again, doing a deep dive into Ottawa and, of course, keeping you up to date with the most recent news in women's hockey. Until then, peace out, everybody.